The council tried to extort humanity, but their reply sent shockwave. The fluorescent glow of the translation matrix painted the interior of the human delegation chamber in shifting hues of blue and gold. Ambassador Catherine Holt sat at the head of a long table constructed from recycled titanium, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, watching the holographic projection of Council Minister Veltharion flicker with each word he spoke. The Keithrani diplomat was tall even by the standards of his own species, his chitinous plumage a deep indigo that rippled with agitation. Behind him, the vast curving architecture of the council chamber on orbital station Meridian was visible, a cathedral of polished obsidian and floating light sculptures that had been designed to intimidate lesser species into submission. It had worked on hundreds of worlds. It would not work here. Ambassador Holt, Veltharion said, his mandibles clicking with practiced cadence, the Council of Ascended Civilizations has reviewed your species' application for associate membership. We have examined your technological development, your biological capabilities, and your cultural output. The deliberation has been thorough. Catherine said nothing. She let the silence stretch. It was a technique she had learned in 11 years of diplomatic service, first on Earth, then during the chaotic First Contact period, and now in this grinding 3-year process of humanity's attempted integration into the galactic community. Silence made most species uncomfortable. The Keithrani, who communicated partially through subharmonic frequencies that filled empty space with subtle emotional undertones, found it especially unnerving. Veltharion's plumage shifted slightly, a sign of irritation. After extensive review, he continued, the Council has reached a decision. Humanity will be granted provisional associate status, contingent upon compliance with several conditions. Behind Catherine, Colonel Marcus Webb shifted in his seat. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that had seen combat on 3 continents before humanity had ever looked up at the stars and found them already occupied. He was not here as a diplomat. He was here because the human government had learned, through bitter experience during the Venkari incident, that military presence was not optional when dealing with the Council. His presence was a statement, and Veltharion's occasional glance toward him confirmed that the statement had been received. The conditions are as follows, Veltharion said, producing a floating data scroll that unrolled in the air between them with a soft hum of projected light. First, humanity will surrender all rights to independent stellar navigation beyond the Sol system. All human vessels will be required to carry Council transponders and will travel only along approved trade routes. Catherine's expression did not change. Second, humanity will remit an annual resource tribute to the Council Governance Fund. This tribute will consist of rare earth minerals, refined lithium, deuterium fuel stocks, and biological samples from your planet's unique biosphere. The Council has prepared a detailed manifest. The data scroll expanded, scrolling through line after line of materials, quantities, and delivery schedules. The numbers were staggering. If implemented, the tribute would consume nearly 40% of Earth's industrial output. Third, Veltharion continued, and here his plumage flared wide, a gesture that in Keithrani body language conveyed absolute authority. Humanity will restrict its military capabilities to system defense only. All offensive fleet assets will be decommissioned or transferred to Council oversight. Your species' recent construction of orbital weapons platforms in the Sol system is noted with concern. Colonel Webb's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. Catherine felt the shift in air pressure from the subtle movement and spoke before he could. Minister Veltharion, she said, her voice calm and measured, are these the terms presented by the full council, or are they your personal recommendation? The question landed like a stone in still water. Veltharion's subharmonics stuttered for just a fraction of a second, a hiccup in the emotional frequency that the translation matrix faithfully converted into a brief wavering in the holographic image. These are the terms of the council, he said too quickly, unanimously approved by all 7 seated members. Catherine nodded slowly. She reached beneath the table and retrieved a thin tablet, its surface dark. She did not turn it on. She simply placed it on the table in front of her as though it were a paperweight. I see, she said, and when were these terms drafted? The deliberation process began approximately. When were they drafted, Minister? Veltharion paused. The final draft was completed 4 cycles ago, approximately 12 of your standard days. 12 days, Catherine repeated. She leaned back in her chair. The Council received our application 3 years ago. You've spent 36 months examining humanity, and you finalized these terms 12 days ago. That suggests the deliberation was rather brief. The bulk of the time was spent in thorough analysis of your. Minister, I have a great deal of respect for you personally, Catherine said, and the shift in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. It was the tone of someone removing gloves. You have been fair in our bilateral discussions, but I must be direct. These are not the terms of membership. These are the terms of subjugation. The word hung in the air. Somewhere in the station's infrastructure, a climate system hummed. Colonel Webb had gone very still. Ambassador Holt, Veltharion said, and now his voice carried an edge, I would caution you against mischaracterizing the Council's generosity. Many species have waited centuries for associate status. Your people have been granted consideration in record time. Generosity, Catherine echoed. She picked up the tablet and for the first time activated it. The screen glowed with columns of data. Let me share with you what our intelligence analysis has compiled over the past 3 years. She turned the tablet so the holographic projector could capture its contents and transmit them to Veltharion's display. This is a record of every species that has been granted associate status by the Council in the last 400 years. There are 37 of them. Of those 37, 29 are currently in a state of economic dependency on Council member systems. Their industrial output is funneled through Council-managed trade corridors. Their technological development has plateaued at levels that the Council deems appropriate. 14 of them have lost the ability to independently construct starships. 6 have populations in decline due to resource extraction mandates. Veltharion's plumage flattened against his skull. This analysis is simplistic and misleading. Associate members receive the benefits of Council protection, access to trade networks, and technological. Protection from what, Minister? Catherine asked. The only military threats in this region of space are the Crocs Raiders, who operate in the Outer Veil and have never attacked a Council-protected system. And the Venkari hegemony, who, as you will recall, withdrew from their incursion into human space after a brief military engagement. She let that last sentence land with precision. The Venkari incident was still a raw nerve in Council politics. The Venkari, a warrior species with a vast fleet, had attempted to seize human mining operations in the asteroid belt. Humanity had responded with a defense that was so swift, so brutally efficient, and so technologically surprising that the Venkari had retreated within 72 hours. The Council had been furious, but not at the Venkari. They had been furious at humanity for escalating a situation that the Council believed should have been resolved through diplomatic channels. Diplomatic channels that, Catherine noted silently, had been completely unresponsive to human distress calls during the 72 hours in question. The point, Catherine continued, is that the Council's associate membership program is not a pathway to equality. It is a pathway to dependency. These terms you have presented are not an invitation, they are an invoice. Veltharion stared at her for a long moment. The subharmonic frequencies emanating from his location had shifted into something cold and controlled. Ambassador Holt, I must remind you that humanity is not in a position of strength here. You are a single-system species with limited interstellar capability. The Council controls the trade routes, the fuel depots, the navigation infrastructure. Without Council cooperation, your species will remain confined to your home system indefinitely. That, Catherine said, sounds like a threat. It is a statement of fact. Catherine glanced at Colonel Webb. The Colonel met her eyes and gave the slightest nod. She turned back to the holographic projection. Minister Veltharion, I want to be very clear about something. When humanity first learned of the Council's existence, there was a debate on Earth about how to proceed. Some argued that we should be grateful, that we should accept whatever terms were offered, that integration into a galactic community was worth any price. Others argued that we should be cautious, that we should protect our sovereignty at all costs. And there was a third group, a small group, who argued something different. She paused. They argued that we should find out what the Council really was. Not what it claimed to be, not what its propaganda said it was, but what it actually was in practice, in effect, in consequence. So we spent 3 years finding out. She tapped the tablet and the data on the screen changed. This is a communication intercept from the Torvalian delegation to the Council, dated 7 months ago. The Torvalians are an associate member species, correct? Level 3 industrial capacity, biologically adapted to high-gravity worlds, known for their metallurgical expertise. Veltharion said nothing. The intercept records a private discussion between the Torvalian associate representative and his government. In it, he describes the Council's resource extraction quotas as unsustainable. He reports that Torval's primary moon is being strip-mined to meet tribute requirements. He estimates that at current rates, Torval will exhaust its accessible mineral reserves within 60 years. He describes his species as being slowly consumed. This is classified Council communication, Veltharion said sharply. How did you obtain this? Catherine ignored the question. We have similar intercepts from 14 other associate species. The pattern is consistent. The Council identifies a developing species, offers associate membership with terms that are initially manageable, then gradually increases tribute requirements while restricting the species' ability to develop independent industry. Within a few generations, the associate species is irreversibly dependent on council systems for basic survival. They become, in effect, client states, resource farms. You are making serious accusations, Veltharion said. His composure was cracking now, the subharmonics leaking a mixture of anger and something else, something that might have been fear. I am making accurate observations, Catherine replied. But let me move past the historical analysis and address the present. You have delivered terms of extortion to the human delegation. You have threatened us with isolation if we do not comply. I am now going to tell you what humanity's reply is. She stood up. It was a simple physical movement, but in the context of the carefully choreographed protocol of council diplomacy, it was a seismic event. Delegates did not stand during negotiations. Standing was a dominance display, a primate behavior that the council's protocol officers had catalogued and classified as aggressive. I am authorized by the United Earth Governance Council, with the unanimous backing of all 193 member nations, to deliver the following response, Catherine said. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a single sheet of paper, real paper, actual cellulose fiber, because the human delegation had deliberately chosen to use physical documents for this moment. The alien species of the council had long since abandoned physical media. The presence of paper was in itself a message. It said, we do not depend on your technology, we do not need your infrastructure, we have our own ways of recording and preserving information. Catherine held the paper up so the holographic projector could capture it. Humanity rejects the council's terms in their entirety. The words appeared on Veltharion's display, translated into Kathrani, into the 6 other official council languages, and into the 14 associate species trade languages that the station's system supported. We will not surrender navigation rights. We will not pay tribute. We will not decommission our defensive systems. We will not accept associate membership on any terms that compromise our sovereignty, our independence, or our right to self-determination. Veltharion's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. Ambassador Holt, you must understand the consequences. I am not finished, Catherine said, and the quiet authority in her voice brought the Kathrani up short. Humanity further declares that we consider the Council's associate membership program, as it has been implemented, to constitute a systematic violation of the rights of sentient species. We consider the extraction of resources from dependent worlds to constitute exploitation. We consider the restriction of technological development among associate species to constitute a form of enslavement, albeit one without chains. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Therefore, humanity does not merely reject your terms. We hereby notify the Council of Ascended Civilizations that we are initiating a formal review of the Council's practices, with the intent of compiling a comprehensive record of the effects of Council policy on associate member species. This review will be conducted independently, without Council oversight or approval. Its findings will be made available to all species in this region of space, whether the Council approves or not. You cannot be serious, Veltharion breathed. Furthermore, Catherine continued, humanity announces the establishment of the Open Sphere Initiative. This initiative will offer any associate member species an alternative to council dependency. We will provide navigation data, technological assistance, and trade partnerships on terms of mutual benefit and equal standing. No tribute, no quotas, no restrictions on development. Any species that wishes to participate may do so freely. The effect of these words, transmitted through the holographic link to Orbital Station Meridian, was like dropping a boulder into a pond. Even though Catherine could not see beyond Veltharion's projection, she knew that the station was buzzing. The Council's communication systems were monitored by hundreds of beings, from junior protocol officers to intelligence analysts to the representatives of associate species who maintained small offices on the station. Every word she spoke was being recorded, translated, analyzed, and most importantly, leaked. That was the plan. Every element of this moment had been choreographed for maximum information penetration. The human delegation had spent months mapping the Council's communication architecture. They knew which systems were monitored, which analysts were sympathetic to associate species grievances, which relay nodes had lax security protocols. The declaration of the Open Sphere Initiative was not just a political statement. It was a broadcast weapon, designed to reach every disaffected world in Council space before the Council could contain it. You are declaring economic war on the Council, Veltharion said. His voice had lost its diplomatic smoothness. The raw, clicking Kathrani speech was breaking through the translation matrix. No, Catherine said, we are declaring that the war you have been waging on developing species silently and slowly is over. We are simply making it visible. Veltharion's image flickered. He was conferring with someone off-screen. Catherine could see the subtle shift in his body language, the way his head turned slightly, the way his subharmonics overlaid with a second set of frequencies, indicating a rapid private conversation. She waited. When he turned back, his composure had been partially restored, but there was something new in his bearing. It was uncertainty. The Kathrani were an old species, one of the 7 founding members of the Council. They had been managing lesser civilizations for millennia. They had never encountered a species that had analyzed their methods, documented their abuses, and then calmly announced an alternative framework in the heart of their own diplomatic station. The Council will need to convene an emergency session to respond to this, Veltharion said. In the meantime, I must inform you that your delegation's credentials on Orbital Station Meridian are under review. You may be asked to vacate the premises. We expected that, Catherine said. Our evacuation protocols are already in place. But I want you to convey one final message to the Council, verbatim, from the United Earth Governance Council. She read from the paper. We do not seek conflict with the Council or its member species. We recognize the achievements of your civilizations and the value of peaceful cooperation. But cooperation must be genuine, not coercive. Partnership must be mutual, not extractive. If the Council is willing to engage with humanity on terms of equality, we welcome that engagement with open hands. If the Council chooses confrontation, we want you to understand something that we believe has been lost in your analysis of our species. She lowered the paper and looked directly into the holographic projector's lens. You have spent 3 years studying our technology, our industry, our biology. You have cataloged our weaknesses and our limitations, but you have not studied our history. You do not understand what humanity is. We are not a species that submits. We are not a species that accepts subjugation. We are a species that has, on multiple occasions in our history, faced forces that seemed overwhelming and insurmountable, and we have broken them. Not because we are the strongest or the most advanced, but because we refuse to kneel. That is not bravery. It is not ideology. It is something deeper than both, something woven into the fabric of who we are. Do not mistake our patience for weakness. Do not mistake our civility for compliance. And do not make the mistake of thinking that because we are young, we are small. She placed the paper on the table. We are humanity and we do not pay tributes. The holographic projection of Veltharion stood motionless for 3 full seconds. Then, without another word, the connection terminated. The blue-gold light in the chamber vanished, leaving only the mundane illumination of human-made LEDs. Catherine exhaled slowly. Her hands were trembling, though she had kept them hidden beneath the table during the entire exchange. Was that everything? Colonel Webb asked. That was everything. You think it'll work? Catherine turned to look at him. Webb's face was unreadable, but she had known him long enough to see the tension in the set of his jaw, the barely contained energy of a man who was built for action but had spent the last 3 hours sitting still. I think it'll do something, she said. Whether it works depends on what happens next. 3 days later, the shockwave hit. It began, as these things often do, in an unexpected place. The Torvalian mining station on the moon of Torval Prime was a sprawling complex of extraction machinery and habitat modules, staffed by 12,000 Torvalian workers who labored in shifts to meet the Council's tribute quotas. The station's communication array was old, maintained with salvaged parts and Torvalian ingenuity, and it picked up the human broadcast on a frequency that the Council's monitoring systems had not thought to block, because no one had ever used that frequency for political content before. The broadcast was in Trade Common, the simplified interstellar language that the Council itself had promoted as a universal medium. It contained Catherine Holt's declaration, translated with meticulous accuracy, along with the data from the intelligence intercepts that the human delegation had compiled. The broadcast repeated on a loop, transmitted on every frequency that the human delegation's limited equipment could reach from their ship, the UNS Vanguard, which had departed Orbital Station Meridian and taken up position in open space beyond the Council's jurisdictional boundary. Within hours, the broadcast had been picked up by stations on 14 different worlds. Within 2 days, it had been translated into 37 languages and was spreading through informal communication networks that the Council had never been able to fully control. The shadow networks that associate species use to share information, gossip, and grievances outside of Council-monitored channels. The Torvalian workers on the mining station listened to the broadcast in silence. Then they stopped working. Not all of them and not immediately, but enough. Enough that the shift supervisors could not maintain production schedules. Enough that the station's management, who reported to a Council-appointed oversight committee, sent urgent messages requesting guidance. The Oversight Committee, staffed by Keith Ronnie administrators who had never set foot on a mining station, responded with a directive to increase disciplinary measures and restore production quotas. The workers did not comply. On the Velari homeworld, a pastoral planet of rolling purple plains and crystalline lakes, the broadcast reached the population through the Velari's own communication satellites, which the Council had allowed them to maintain because the Velari were considered a model associate species. Docile and compliant, their artistic culture celebrated in Council galleries, while their agricultural output fed 3 Council member systems. The Velari listened to the broadcast, and for the first time in 200 years they discussed the terms of their association openly. Not in whispers, not in the private corners of their communal halls, but in public forums, in their legislative assemblies, in their art. The Velari poet Kethrena Voss, whose work was displayed in the Council's Hall of Cultural Achievement on Meridian Station, wrote a poem about the broadcast. It was short, only 12 lines, but it contained a phrase that would become a rallying cry across associate space. Translated roughly into standard English, the phrase was, "We were told the sky was a gift, we did not see the leash." The poem was banned by the Council's Cultural Oversight Bureau within a day. By that point, it had already been memorized and recited by millions. On the Drenala orbital habitats, a species of amphibious engineers who had been associate members for 3 centuries, the response was more structured. The Drenala had long suspected that their technological stagnation was not natural, that the Council's technology-sharing agreements were carefully calibrated to keep them dependent. The human broadcast included technical analysis showing exactly how the agreements functioned, with specific examples of Drenala inventions that had been acquired by Council member corporations through exploitative licensing arrangements, and then locked behind patent walls that prevented the Drenala from using their own creations. The Drenala High Engineering Council, a body that had not convened in emergency session for over 100 years, met within 48 hours of the broadcast. They drafted a formal request for more information from humanity, transmitted it through 7 different relay nodes to avoid Council interception, and received a response within 6 hours. The response was a data package, enormous in scope, containing everything humanity had compiled about the Council's practices, organized and cross-referenced and annotated in meticulous detail. The Drenala shared it with every associate species they could reach. The Council's emergency session, when it finally convened on the 5th day, was not the dignified affair that its founders had envisioned. The 7 seated members, representing the oldest and most powerful species in the region, met in the grand chamber with its obsidian walls and floating light sculptures, but the chamber felt different now. The light sculptures, which were programmed to respond to the emotional atmosphere of the room, had shifted to a muted amber, a color that none of the seated members had seen before. The chamber had never been uncertain before. Veltharion delivered his report with the precision expected of a senior diplomat, but those present could hear the strain beneath his words. He described the human delegation's response, played the full recording of Catherine Holt's statement, and provided an assessment of the broadcast spread. "The transmission has reached at least 14 associate member worlds," he said. "We have been unable to fully suppress it. The humans have exploited gaps in our communication monitoring that we were previously unaware of. Their technical analysis of our associate program is disturbingly accurate. I am unable to confirm or deny the specific intercepts they referenced, but the pattern they describe is consistent with known intelligence." "Known intelligence that was supposed to be secure," said Councillor Praxon of the Saurian bloc, a massive reptilian figure whose scaled hide shifted from green to a warning orange as he spoke. "How did a single system species breach our intelligence networks?" "We underestimated them," Veltharion admitted. The admission cost him. He could feel the weight of it in the subharmonic reactions from the other councillors. Underestimation was, in the Council's culture, the gravest of professional failures. They are not technologically superior to us in any significant area, but they are exceptionally good at finding and exploiting weaknesses in complex systems. Their approach to intelligence gathering appears to be based on a methodology that emphasizes breadth over depth. They collect enormous volumes of low-level data from many sources and then integrate it using analytical frameworks that are, frankly, unlike anything in our intelligence tradition. "In plain language," said Councillor Issim of the Phileni Consortium, her voice a melodic trill that the translation matrix rendered in carefully neutral tones, "they outsmarted us." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence. "We must respond decisively," said Councillor Gron, representing the Vordrathi Empire, a species of silicon-based lifeforms whose crystalline bodies refracted the chamber's light into prismatic patterns as they moved. "The humans have committed an act of economic aggression against the Council. They have attempted to undermine our relationship with associate species. This cannot go unanswered. What response do you propose? Asked Councillor Lehara, the only member who spoke with any noticeable warmth, representing the Urani, a species of sessile plant-like beings who communicated through chemical signals and projected avatars. Military action against a single system species, that would validate every accusation they have made. The accusations are irrelevant, Gran said. What matters is the perception of strength. If we allow a primitive species to defy us without consequence, every associate member will take note. Every associate member has already taken note, Isim said sharply. That is the problem. The humans have not merely defied us, they have made our defiance visible. They have given a name and a framework to what the associate species have long felt but could never articulate. You cannot undo that with a military strike. You would only confirm their narrative. The debate raged for hours. Positions shifted, alliances formed and dissolved, and several proposals were drafted and discarded. A trade embargo against humanity was proposed and rejected when it became clear that humanity's trade with associate species, though still in its infancy, would simply route around any embargo through the same shadow networks the broadcast had used. A military demonstration, a show of force near the Sol system, was proposed and tabled when military analysts pointed out that the human defense network, built in response to the Venkari incursion, was considerably more robust than the Council had previously assessed. That assessment had been another failure. The Council's military intelligence had relied on data from before the Venkari incident, data that showed humanity as having a modest orbital defense capability. The reality, as the Venkari had discovered, was that humanity had used the 2-year warning period between first contact and the Venkari attack to undergo a military-industrial mobilization that, in its speed and scale, had no parallel in Council history. In 24 months, humanity had constructed a defensive network that included kinetic strike platforms, electromagnetic pulse generators, point defense laser arrays, and a fleet of fast-attack corvettes that were primitive by Council standards but devastatingly effective in the close-range engagements that characterize system defense. The Venkari had lost 11 warships. Humanity had lost 1 orbital platform and suffered casualties in the low hundreds. The lopsided result had been classified by the Venkari, but the Council had its own sources, and the data had been disturbing enough that the military demonstration proposal was quietly withdrawn. On the 8th day, the Council issued a public statement. It was measured, diplomatic, and entirely unconvincing. It described the human delegation's statements as regrettable misunderstandings and reaffirmed the Council's commitment to the prosperity and development of all member and associate species. It made no reference to the specific accusations, offered no response to the data packages, and did not mention the Open Sphere Initiative by name. The statement was analyzed, dissected, and ridiculed across associate space. The phrase regrettable misunderstandings became a meme, repeated in dozens of languages as shorthand for a blatant denial of obvious truth. Humanity's response to the Council's statement was equally measured. Ambassador Holt, speaking from the UNS Vanguard, released a brief message. We welcome the Council's commitment to the prosperity of all species. We look forward to seeing this commitment reflected in concrete policy changes. In the meantime, the Open Sphere Initiative remains open to all. It was devastating in its simplicity. It offered no attack, no escalation, no provocative rhetoric. It simply pointed with polite clarity at the gap between the Council's words and its actions. 6 weeks after the broadcast, the first associate species formally requested entry into the Open Sphere Initiative. It was the Torvalians. The request was transmitted through a chain of relay nodes that wound through unmonitored space, a communication route that the Torvalian resistance movement had spent decades building for exactly this kind of purpose, though they had never expected to use it. The message was brief and direct, written in trade common with the formal cadence of Torvalian diplomatic tradition. The Torvalian Provisional Government, recognized by the elected assemblies of 14 of our 15 major settlements, hereby requests participation in the Open Sphere Initiative. We seek partnership on terms of mutual benefit and equal standing, as described in the human broadcast. We are prepared to offer access to our metallurgical expertise and mineral resources in exchange for technological assistance and trade cooperation. We understand the risks of this request. We make it nonetheless. Catherine Holt received the message at 300 hours ship time, alone in her cabin on the Vanguard. She read it 3 times, then she woke Colonel Webb. It started, she said. Webb took the tablet, read the message, and handed it back. How many more? We don't know. The Drenala have been in informal contact. The Veleri are discussing it openly. There are rumors from at least 6 other worlds. And the Council? The Council is doing what empires always do when they're caught in a lie. They're trying to change the subject. There's a proposal to expand the associate membership program, offer more favorable initial terms to new applicants, create a review process for existing associates. It's designed to look like reform without actually being reform. Will it work? On some worlds, maybe. On others, no. The genie is out of the bottle, Marcus. You can't put it back. Webb was quiet for a moment. What happens when the council decides to stop playing defense? Catherine had asked herself that question every day since the broadcast. She had a file, classified at the highest levels of the Earth government, that contained humanity's contingency plans for council retaliation. The plans ranged from diplomatic to economic to military, and none of them were comfortable. Then we'll deal with it, she said, the way we always do. The Torvalian request was followed over the next 3 months by requests from the Dranala, the Velari, the Orath, the Kelvashi, and 9 other species. Each request was different, shaped by the unique circumstances and needs of the applying species, but they all shared a common thread: a willingness to take a risk, to reach for something that had never been offered before, to trust that a species they had never met in person might actually mean what it said about equality and mutual benefit. Humanity's response to each request was careful and deliberate. The Earth Governance Council had anticipated this phase and had prepared detailed frameworks for different types of partnerships. Technical assistance agreements were drafted with input from human scientists and engineers who had studied each species' capabilities and needs. Trade terms were negotiated by human economists who had spent months analyzing galactic resource flows. Navigation data was shared through secure channels that human cryptographers had designed to be resistant to Council interception. The process was slow, deliberately slow. Humanity did not want to make mistakes, did not want to overpromise, did not want to create dependencies of its own. The irony of replicating the Council's methods, even inadvertently, was not lost on the people involved. Every agreement was reviewed by an independent ethics board that included human rights advocates, development economists, and, where possible, representatives from other associate species who had already joined the initiative. The Open Sphere Initiative was not a perfect system. It was not a utopia. It was an experiment, imperfect and uncertain, built on the radical premise that cooperation between species could be based on something other than power asymmetry. And it was working. The evidence was not dramatic at first. A Torvalian mining operation restarted under new management, producing minerals for trade rather than tribute. A Dranala engineering firm, freed from Council PAT restrictions, began developing a new type of propulsion system that combined Dranala materials science with human computing architecture. A Velari agricultural cooperative, no longer required to send 70% of its output to Council member systems, began selling directly to other associate species through initiative trade networks. Small changes, incremental and unremarkable on their own, but they added up. Within a year, the combined economic output of the Open Sphere's member species had increased by 12%. Within 2 years, the Dranala had constructed their first independently designed starship in 3 centuries. It was not a warship. It was a cargo vessel, ugly by the standards of Council aesthetics but functional and fast, built to carry Dranala-manufactured goods to initiative trade hubs without passing through Council-monitored space lanes. The Council noticed. The Council's response when it finally came was not military, it was legal. On the anniversary of Catherine Holt's declaration, the Council's judicial arbiter, a Vordrathi legal scholar named Chrysalis VII, issued a ruling that the Open Sphere Initiative constituted an unauthorized interstellar economic organization operating in contravention of Council trade jurisdiction. The ruling declared that all trade between initiative members that passed through or near Council-monitored space lanes was subject to Council regulation and taxation. It further declared that any species participating in the initiative while holding associate member status with the Council was in violation of its association agreement and subject to sanctions, up to and including revocation of associate status and loss of access to Council infrastructure. The ruling was, by the standards of Council law, technically sound. The Council's legal framework had been constructed over millennia specifically to give the Council jurisdiction over interstellar economic activity in its sphere of influence. The Open Sphere Initiative, by operating outside of that framework, was in clear violation. But the ruling had a problem, the same problem that every Council action had since the broadcast: it was visible. When the Council had enforced its trade jurisdiction in the past, it had done so quietly through administrative actions that affected shipping permits, fuel allocations, and docking clearances. The affected species had no recourse, no audience, no way to appeal to a broader public. The enforcement was invisible, and invisibility was the key to its effectiveness. Now every enforcement action was watched, recorded, and broadcast. When the Council revoked the Torvalian Associate status, the revocation order was transmitted to every communication node in Associate space within hours. When the Council imposed trade sanctions on the Drenala, the specific sanctions were analyzed by human economists and Drenala engineers, who published a joint report showing that the sanctions would cost the Drenala approximately 8% of their GDP, but could be fully offset through increased trade with other initiative members within 18 months. The Council's legal weapon, honed over millennia of invisible enforcement, had been blunted by transparency. This was humanity's greatest innovation in the galactic arena, and it was not technological. It was conceptual. The species of the Council had developed their systems of control in an environment where information was scarce, where communication between subject species was difficult and expensive, where the ruling species could control the narrative simply by controlling the flow of information. Humanity had grown up in a different environment. On Earth, the rise of global communication networks had made information abundant, uncontrollable, and self-propagating. Humanity understood, at a visceral level, how transparency could undermine systems of control that depended on opacity. They had brought this understanding to the stars, and it had turned out to be more powerful than any weapon. The Council's final attempt to reassert control came 18 months after the broadcast, and it took a form that no one had anticipated. Councillor Gron, the Vordrathi representative, had been the most vocal advocate of a military response from the beginning. He had been outvoted repeatedly, sidelined by the more cautious councillors, and humiliated by the failure of the legal approach. But Gron was patient, and he had resources that the other councillors did not fully understand. The Vordrathi were a silicon-based species, and their biology gave them capabilities that carbon-based lifeforms found difficult to comprehend. Their crystalline neural structures could process information at speeds that made even the fastest organic brains seem sluggish. They could interface directly with certain types of computer systems, bypassing conventional security measures. And they had a cultural tradition, dating back millions of years, of strategic planning on timescales that other species considered absurd. Gron had been planning since the day of Catherine Holt's declaration. Not a military strike, not a legal action, but something more subtle and potentially more devastating. A psychological operation designed to fracture the open sphere initiative from within. The operation exploited a vulnerability that Gron had identified early, one that the humans themselves had discussed but had been unable to fully address. The open sphere initiative was built on trust, specifically the trust that associate species placed in humanity's good intentions. This trust was humanity's greatest asset, but it was also its most fragile because it was based on a relationship that, in many cases, existed only through communication channels. Most associate species had never met a human being in person. Their entire experience of humanity was mediated through translated messages, data packages, and trade agreements. Gron's operation was designed to poison that trust. It began with a series of forged communications, ostensibly from human sources, that began appearing in the shadow networks. The forgeries were expertly crafted, using human linguistic patterns and communication protocols that the Vordrathi had spent months studying. They contained messages that were subtly undermining, not overtly hostile, but designed to plant seeds of doubt. A forged message from a fictional human trade official suggested that the terms offered to the Torvalians were intentionally generous to create dependence on human technology. A forged internal human government memo, leaked to a Velari cultural network, discussed the strategic value of Velari agricultural output in terms that reduced the Velari to a resource to be exploited. A forged conversation between two human military officers, intercepted and shared with the Drenala, speculated about the military applications of Drenala propulsion technology. The forgeries were good, not perfect, but good enough to be plausible, and they were released at carefully chosen moments, timed to coincide with real events that lent them credibility. A forged message expressing concern about Torvalian mining safety was released the day after a real equipment malfunction at a Torvalian facility. A forged discussion of human military planning was released during a period of increased tension between the Council and the Initiative over a border incident. Effect was slow but steady. Trust, once eroded, was difficult to rebuild. The Torvalian Provisional Government began asking harder questions about the terms of their partnership. The Velari poets, who had been the Initiative's most passionate advocates, began writing poems about the danger of replacing one master with another. The Drenala, the most technically sophisticated of the Initiative members, began conducting their own analysis of human communications, looking for patterns of deception. Humanity detected the operation relatively quickly. The Vordratha's technical capabilities were impressive, but they were operating in an information environment that humanity understood better than any species in the galaxy. The forged communications were identified by a team of human intelligence analysts working with Drenala engineers who had developed new cryptographic verification tools specifically designed for cross-species communication. The forgeries were traced to Vordrathi sources through a combination of traffic analysis, linguistic fingerprinting, and good old-fashioned detective work by a Drenala data archaeologist named Shellcrafter 9, who had a talent for finding patterns in chaos. The question was what to do about it. A public denunciation would expose the forgeries, but it would also reveal the extent of the vulnerability that the forgeries had exploited. It would force the initiative to confront the fact that trust, their foundational principle, could be manipulated. It would give Gron a partial victory because the damage done by the forgeries could not be entirely undone even after they were exposed. Catherine Holt convened an emergency meeting of the initiative's Coordinating Council, a body that included representatives from all 16 member species, connected via a secure communication channel that the Drenala had designed specifically to resist Vordrathi interception. "We have identified a coordinated deception operation targeting the initiative," she said. "The operation is being conducted by Vordrathi intelligence under the direction of Councillor Gron. Its purpose is to undermine trust between initiative members and humanity. We have identified 14 forged communications that have been disseminated over the past 4 months." She paused. The channel was silent. 16 species, represented by beings of vastly different biology and psychology, all waiting to hear what came next. "We could denounce the forgeries publicly," she continued. "We could present our evidence, expose the Vordrathi operation, and attempt to restore trust through transparency. That is the obvious response. It is what the Council expects us to do." "What is the alternative?" asked Torvalian Representative Ironhello, his subharmonic voice resonant with the deep frequencies of his species' underground communication tradition. "The alternative," Catherine said, "is to do something that has no precedent in galactic diplomacy. We publish everything." A ripple of reactions passed through the channel. Translated subharmonics, chemical signals, electromagnetic pulses, and visual gestures all converged into a single question. What does everything mean? "Everything means everything," Catherine said. "Not just the forgeries, not just our evidence of Vordrathi involvement, our entire intelligence operation against the Council. Every intercept, every analysis, every assessment we have made of the Council, its members, its methods, and its intentions, including our assessments of each of you." The silence that followed was different from any silence that had preceded it. "Assessed you," she said, addressing the assembled representatives directly. "Before we invited you into the initiative, we analyzed your species, your politics, your economics, your vulnerabilities. We did this because we needed to understand what we were getting into and because we could not afford to be naive. These assessments contain honest evaluations of your strengths and weaknesses. Some of them are flattering, some of them are not. Some of them contain information that you will find uncomfortable." "Why would we do this?" she continued, anticipating the question. "Because the Vordrathi operation exposed a fundamental flaw in our approach. We asked you to trust us, but we did not extend the same trust to you. We held back information that we deemed too sensitive to share. We made decisions about what you should and should not know. In doing so, we replicated on a smaller scale the same dynamic that we have been criticizing the Council for. We cannot build a genuine partnership on selective transparency. We must be fully transparent even when it is costly, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it risks the trust we are trying to build." She took a breath. "So I am asking you, as the Coordinating Council of the Open Sphere Initiative, to approve the full release of all human intelligence materials related to the Council and to Initiative member species. No redactions, no selective editing, everything." The debate that followed was the most difficult and honest discussion that had ever taken place in the initiative's short history. Some representatives were outraged at the idea that humanity had been conducting intelligence assessments of their species. Others argued that the assessments were a necessary precaution and that full transparency was a dangerous overreaction. The Drenala representative, a being named Logicweaver 3, pointed out that the Drenala had been conducting their own intelligence assessments of humanity, and that mutual transparency would require them to publish theirs as well. The Velari representative, a poet named Softrain, spoke last. Her words, translated from the Velari's liquid tonal language, were simple. "We left the Council because they told us the sky was a gift and hid the leash. If humanity tells us that the sky is a gift and shows us the leash, then humanity is not the Council. Publish everything." The vote was 14-2 in favor. The publication of humanity's full intelligence files was an event without precedent in galactic history. No species had ever voluntarily disclosed its complete intelligence holdings to its partners. The data volume was enormous, encompassing thousands of intercepts, analyses, assessments, and operational plans, covering every aspect of the Council's activities and humanity's understanding of each initiative member species. The immediate reaction was shock. The Torvalian government discovered that humanity had accurately identified the internal political divisions within their provisional government and had developed contingency plans for 3 different scenarios of Torvalian political collapse. The Dranala learned that human analysts had assessed their propulsion technology as being potentially revolutionary and had identified specific areas where human computing expertise could accelerate Dranala development, information that the Dranala could have used to negotiate more favorable terms in their initial agreement. But the most significant revelation was not about humanity's assessments of its partners. It was about humanity's assessment of itself. Buried in the intelligence files in a section that human analysts had expected to be the most controversial was an honest, unsparing evaluation of humanity's own capabilities, limitations, and vulnerabilities. It cataloged humanity's technological weaknesses, its industrial bottlenecks, its political divisions, and its military limitations. It included a frank assessment of the risks that the Open Sphere initiative posed to humanity, including the possibility that associate species might use human technology to build military capabilities that could eventually threaten Earth. It acknowledged that humanity's motives were not purely altruistic, that the initiative served human strategic interests as well as idealistic ones, and that the line between the two was often unclear. It was, in essence, a document that no intelligence agency in human history had ever voluntarily produced, a complete and honest accounting of itself, including the parts that were ugly, self-serving, and afraid. The effect on initiative member species was profound. The Torvalians, who had been drifting towards suspicion, were stunned by the openness. The Dranala, who prided themselves on logical analysis, recognized the strategic irrationality of the disclosure and concluded that it must be genuine, because no rational actor would willingly reveal such information unless they were committed to a principle that transcended strategic calculation. The Velari poets wrote about it extensively, producing a body of work that would eventually be regarded as a literary masterpiece of interstellar culture. The effect on the Council was equally profound but different in character. The Council's intelligence services, which had obtained copies of the published files through their own networks, spent weeks analyzing them with the intensity usually reserved for military threats. They found exactly what humanity had intended them to find: a complete picture of humanity's understanding of the Council, laid bare without evasion or deception. This created a strategic puzzle that the Council's analysts could not solve. If humanity was weak, as the files showed, then why had they provoked a confrontation with the Council? If humanity was strong, as their actions suggested, then why had they published a document showing their weaknesses? If humanity was deceitful, then why were the files so honest? If humanity was honest, then what did that mean for every assumption the Council had made about how intelligent species behaved in a competitive environment? The answer, of course, was that humanity did not fit the Council's models. The Council's entire analytical framework was built on the assumption that species acted rationally in pursuit of self-interest, where rationality was defined as the maximization of advantage and the minimization of vulnerability. Humanity's behavior violated this assumption in ways that were not irrational, but rather operated according to a different logic, one that included factors like principle, trust, and the long-term benefits of genuine cooperation, factors that the Council's models treated as irrelevant noise. Gron, confronted with the failure of his operation and the exposure of Vordrathi intelligence methods, retreated into silence. The other counselors, who had been watching the initiative's growth with a mixture of concern and grudging admiration, began to reassess their positions. It was Counselor Lehara of the Urani who broke the deadlock. The Urani, as a sessile species, had a unique perspective on power dynamics. They could not move, could not fight, could not flee. Their survival over millions of years had depended on their ability to understand and influence the species around them through communication, chemistry, and the patient cultivation of relationships. They understood better than any mobile species the power of vulnerability honestly offered. Lehara's address to the Council was brief. The Urani did not waste words. "The humans have done something that we have never done," she said, her chemical avatar projecting calm green light into the chamber. "They have told the truth about themselves, not because it benefits them, but because they believe it is necessary. We have spent millennia building systems of control based on the assumption that truth is a weapon to be hoarded and deception is a tool to be wielded. The humans have demonstrated that truth can be a foundation instead. We can continue to fight this, and we will lose because you cannot fight an idea with a bureaucracy. Or we can adapt. I propose that the Council invite the humans to open negotiations for a new framework of interstellar relations, one that is based on the principles they have demonstrated rather than the principles we have enforced. The vote was 4-3 in favor. The negotiations that followed were long, difficult, and marked by moments of genuine tension and genuine breakthrough. They took place over the course of 2 years on a neutral station that the Drenala constructed specifically for the purpose, located in open space beyond any species' jurisdictional claim. The station was called Convergence, and it was, by the standards of galactic architecture, unremarkable, functional, efficient, and deliberately unimposing. It was designed to make no statement of power or prestige, to be simply a place where beings could meet as equals. Humanity's negotiating team was led by Catherine Holt, who had been promoted to the newly created position of Secretary of Extraterrestrial Affairs. She was assisted by a rotating cast of experts, including human economists, scientists, military officers, and in a move that surprised the Council, representatives from each of the initiative's member species. The initiative did not negotiate as a bloc, but its members were present as observers and informal advisors, a constant reminder that humanity was not acting alone. The Council's team was led by Veltharion, who had been given the assignment as both a recognition of his expertise and a subtle punishment for his failure to prevent the crisis. He approached the negotiations with the careful precision of a career diplomat, but there was something different in his bearing now. The certainty that had characterized his earlier interactions with humanity was gone, replaced by a quality that his colleagues found difficult to categorize. It was not deference exactly. It was more like respect, earned reluctantly through the hard evidence of experience. The framework that emerged from the negotiations was called the Convergence Accord. It was not a treaty in the traditional sense, because the parties to it did not recognize a single authority with the power to enforce it. Instead, it was a set of shared principles and practical agreements, held together not by coercive power but by mutual benefit and transparent verification. The key principles were simple. Sovereignty was absolute for all signatory species. No species could impose tribute, quotas, or technological restrictions on another. Trade would be conducted on terms negotiated freely between parties. Dispute resolution would be handled through independent arbitration. Information would be shared openly, with limited exceptions for genuine security concerns, and those exceptions would be subject to review by a transparent oversight body. The practical agreements were more complex, covering navigation rights, resource sharing, technology transfer, and communication protocols. Each agreement was hammered out through months of detailed negotiation, with every clause scrutinized by representatives of multiple species who brought different perspectives and different concerns to the table. The Convergence Accord was signed by the 7 Council species, all 16 initiative species, and 11 additional associate species who had been waiting on the sidelines to see which way the wind blew. It was not a perfect document. It contained compromises that satisfied no one completely, ambiguities that would require future negotiation, and gaps that would need to be filled by experience. But it was real. 5 years after Catherine Holt had stood up in the human delegation chamber and told the Council that humanity does not pay tribute, she stood in the main hall of Convergence Station and watched as representatives of 34 species affixed their signatures, their chemical seals, their biometric identifiers, and their vocal acknowledgments to the accord. The hall was not grand. It was a converted cargo bay that the Drenala had retrofitted with seating and translation equipment. The walls were bare metal, the lighting was functional, and the temperature was carefully calibrated to a range that was merely uncomfortable for all species rather than intolerable for any. No one had wanted the signing to take place in a grand chamber, because grand chambers were built to intimidate, and the accord was built on the rejection of intimidation. Veltharion was the last to sign. He approached the document, which was displayed on a screen that could be read in all 34 signatory languages, and placed his clawed hand on the biometric scanner. The system registered his identity, and his signature appeared on the document, rendered in flowing Keithrani script. He turned to Catherine. His plumage was a deep blue, a color that she had learned over 5 years of working with him signified something between respect and reconciliation. Ambassador Holt, he said. The title was ceremonial now, she had not been an ambassador for years. But he used it as a gesture, an acknowledgement of the first time they had faced each other across a divide that had seemed unbridgeable. Councillor Veltharion, she replied. He had been elevated to the council in the aftermath of the crisis, a promotion that was partly a reward for his handling of the negotiations and partly a recognition that the old council needed new voices. I have a question, he said. I have wanted to ask it for years, but the moment never seemed appropriate. Well, ask. When you delivered your original response to the council's terms, did you know what would happen? Did you have a plan that accounted for all of this? He gestured broadly, encompassing the accord, the station, the assembled species. Catherine was quiet for a moment. She thought about the night before the declaration, when she had sat alone in her cabin on the Vanguard, reviewing the response one last time, knowing that if it failed, humanity would face isolation, potential sanctions, and possibly military confrontation. She thought about the meetings with the Earth Governance Council, the arguments about risk and reward, the moment when the vote had been taken and the decision had been made, not because the outcome was certain, but because the alternative was unacceptable. No, she said, we had analyses and contingencies, but we didn't know. We couldn't know. We made the best assessment we could and then we acted because acting on incomplete information is what humans do. We don't wait for certainty. We don't wait for guarantees. We decide what's right and then we live with the consequences. Veltharian's plumage rippled. That is terrifying, he said. Yes, Catherine agreed, it is. It is also, he added slowly, why you won. Catherine looked at him. Then she looked at the hall, at the beings from 34 different worlds who had come to this plain, functional room to sign a document that said, in essence, that they would try to treat each other as equals. Some of them were old, with civilizations that stretched back millions of years. Some were young, like humanity, with barely a few centuries of technological development. Some of them had been enemies, had fought wars over resources and territory and pride. All of them had chosen to be here. We didn't win, Catherine said. We all did, or none of us did, I'm still not sure which. Veltharian clicked his mandibles in what she had learned to recognize as a Keithrani smile. Perhaps, he said, that is the point. The ceremony concluded. The representatives filed out of the cargo bay and into the corridors of Convergence Station, where Dranala engineers had set up refreshment stations offering beverages and foodstuffs compatible with 34 different biochemistries. The conversations that followed were awkward, stilted, and occasionally incomprehensible, as beings who had never shared a room before tried to find common ground through the imperfect medium of trade common and translation matrices. But they were talking, and that, more than any document or principle or framework, was what mattered. In the months and years that followed, the Convergence Accord was tested in ways that its signatories had not anticipated. Disputes arose over resource allocation, trade imbalances, and territorial boundaries. Old grievances between species did not disappear simply because a new framework had been established. There were setbacks, betrayals, and moments when the entire structure seemed ready to collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. But it did not collapse. It bent, adapted, and grew stronger with each challenge because it was built on a foundation that the Council's old system had never possessed: the genuine consent and participation of all its members, including the weakest. Humanity's role in this new galactic order was not what the alarmists on Earth had feared or the idealists had hoped. Humanity did not become a galactic superpower, did not dominate the convergence framework, did not replace the Council as a new hegemonic authority. Humanity was one species among many, with its own strengths and weaknesses, its own contributions and limitations, its own voice in a chorus of voices. But humanity's voice carried a particular weight, not because of power or technology, but because of what it had done. Humanity had been the species that stood up. Humanity had been the species that said no. Humanity had been the species that looked at an ancient, entrenched system of exploitation and declared, in words that had been translated into every language in known space, that it would not participate, that it would build something different, that it would trust others with the truth even when the truth was costly. That example, more than any technology or resource or military capability, was humanity's greatest contribution to the galactic community. It was an example that other species could follow, adapt, and make their own. It was an example that said, you do not have to accept the world as you find it, you can change it, not because you are powerful enough to force change, but because you are brave enough to attempt it. The story of the Convergence Accord was written and rewritten by historians of many species, each emphasizing different aspects, different causes, different lessons. But in every version, in every language, on every world where the story was told, there was a moment that all accounts shared. The moment when a human woman stood up in a small chamber on a space station and spoke words that shattered 1,000 years of silence. We are humanity and we do not pay tributes. The shockwave from those words had traveled far. It had crossed boundaries of species and biology and language. It had toppled empires not through force, but through the simple, devastating power of an idea whose time had come. And in the vast, strange, beautiful galaxy that humanity now shared with 33 other species, the idea continued to spread, rippling outward like a signal through the dark, carrying with it a message that every sentient being on every world could understand in the deepest part of themselves. You are not less than you do not kneel, you are free. The shockwave had not faded. It was still traveling, still growing, still carrying its message to the farthest reaches of known space and beyond, into the unknown dark where new species waited to hear it, New voices waited to join the chorus, and new stories waited to be told. And humanity, young and small and stubborn and brave, was at the heart of it, where it had always been, where it had chosen to stand, where it would remain. Not because humanity was the strongest, but because humanity had refused to be anything less than itself.